Over the past year, Russia has pushed hard to capture key territories in Ukraine. A few days before staging a full-on assault, President Vladimir Putin recognized Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states. It advanced towards Kiev on the 24th of February 2022, aiming to take the capital in just 3 days. But they were met with strong resistance from Ukrainian forces, leading to clashes across the country for the next few months. Our tough battles were fought in the months that came after, some of them taking place in the city of Kherson, before Ukraine successfully reclaimed it in November last year. Russia, though, notched its own victory just 2 months later when it captured the salt mining town of Soledar in January. Now, both are focused on Bakhmut, a city that could be Russia's gateway to two larger cities further west. The fight for Bakhmut has emerged as one of the longest battles of the war so far. It's also come to symbolize Ukrainian resistance to this much bigger aggressor. But even as Kiev marks small victories on the battlefield, it's also bracing to defend against a fresh spring offensive in the second year of the war. Well, let's bring in our guest, Lyle Goldstein. He's Director of Asia Engagement at Defense Priorities. He's also a visiting professor of international and public affairs at Brown University. He joins us from Washington, D.C. And also joining us is Professor Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. Welcome, gentlemen. We were talking about battlefield fights just before we crossed to you, but in the last few days, we have seen the fight being taken even more intensively to the narrative. So speeches, commemoration ceremonies, we've heard all sorts of rhetoric. But if you try to look beyond that, Russian President Vladimir Putin, in his State of the Nation address, announced Russia's suspension of its participation in the New START nuclear non-proliferation agreement. Now, that may be more symbolic than actually substantial. But for the two of you, does that raise your concerns about escalation? Let's start with Professor Freedman.
Not particularly. I think it was, as you say, symbolic. It's sad in the sense this was the last of the great arms control agreements that marked the end of the Cold War. And it's not good that there's less discussion and dialogue between the two big nuclear powers. And I think Russia wants us to keep on thinking about its nuclear capabilities, but it doesn't indicate that they're prepared to sort of go nuclear in this conflict. The fact is they're using nuclear deterrence quite effectively already, which is why Western countries are supporting Ukraine with weapons, but they're not fighting side by side. That, I think, has always been Putin's big red line. So it's limited the conflict. Equally, nuclear deterrence means that Putin has not attacked NATO countries. So it's an unfortunate thing, but in the end, that was about all that Putin had to add to the positions he's already taken in the past.
Professor Goldstein, would you agree with that?
No, I don't. I think this is very troubling. There really are almost no lines of communication between Washington and Moscow, and this is one of the few that were left. So this is highly regrettable. But we've seen arms control progressively fall apart, to be charitable, over the last 20 years, and this is devastating for global stability. Moreover, I read Russian fluently, and I read a lot of Russian media, and there are nuclear threats happening very frequently now. They're not picked up in the Western press, regrettably. I found 6 in the last month from very senior officials, including Ryabkov and former generals like Netkachev, Garyulov. These are people who understand these weapons and who are saying that tactical nuclear weapons could be extremely effective for Russia. So, we seem to be ignoring these warnings. I think it's very troubling, and we've got to get the situation under control because it is spinning out of control. And there are other avenues of escalation. I don't even want to talk about pipelines and issues like that, but there is a real danger in the second year that this war could become a much larger war.
Oh, for sure. Washington is not missing signs of potential.
Can I come back on that?
No, of course, certainly, yes, please do.
No, I mean, these threats have been issued by Russians since 2014. It's not unusual. Yes, of course, we've got to take nuclear war seriously because the weapons are there. But we look at what Putin has said, which is the most important. He's been absolutely clear where his red lines are. If NATO engages on Ukraine's behalf directly, possibly if NATO provides systems that can attack directly into Russia, then there are dangers. But Putin is using nuclear deterrence now, and he jeopardizes that if he uses a tactical nuclear weapons. And no military expert I've spoken to believes that tactical nuclear weapons are going to make a massive difference to the battlefield. All it does is create enormous new uncertainties for Russia as well as for the rest of us.
I'll cut in here. And wherever we are in terms of nuclear uncertainties, in order to reach any kind of negotiation, there has to be some certainty on Ukraine's red lines, Russia's red lines, I suppose Washington's red lines as well. And what is the baseline for any deal that any one party is prepared to accept? So, Professor Freedman, your suggestion is when you talk about Putin, there is an implicit assumption that you know where Mr. Putin stands and how much he's willing to accept, how much he's not willing to accept. Would you agree with that, or have I misread you?
I think that, we know Putin has claimed that he's annexed 4 provinces in addition to Crimea. He doesn't actually hold all the territory, so he's currently engaged in an offensive to gain more territory. So he wants to partition Ukraine. Ukraine obviously is not going to accept that. So that's why it's hard to be at all optimistic of any basis for negotiation at the moment. Ukraine wants to take its territory back. Putin wants more of it.
Professor Goldstein?
Well, I'm a little more optimistic that an agreement could be reached in the near term. I think Ukrainians have fought incredibly bravely and won a great victory already. Russia is deeply humiliated. And I think both President Putin and also Zelensky, that they may not say it, but they're both very deeply aware of the huge cost that both countries are paying. And I must push back, no disrespect to Professor Freedman, but Putin has not been very clear about his red lines. His last statement on the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons said there's no need for that now. And just before that, President Biden said we're closer to Armageddon than we have been in 60 years. So I think you're downplaying the risks, and many people in the West seem to be doing that. I think it's irresponsible.
All right. Let me pick up what Professor Freedman mentioned before we heard from you, Professor Goldstein, which is about ceding of territory. Both of you were featured in an extended article by Foreign Affairs late last month, in which you both contributed your opinion on whether or not you thought it was likely or unlikely that the outcome of this war would involve Ukraine having to cede territory. Interestingly, one of you strongly agreed, the other one disagreed. If I could start with Professor Goldstein first, give me your position, and then Professor Freedman can pick up from there.
Well, yes, I think that we have to be realistic. We have to use realism and restraint as we think about this question. I mean, this war could go on for another 20 years. Peter the Great's war against Sweden went on for almost 20 years, and that may very well be what Putin has in mind. But, given the escalation risks, given the immense suffering of the Ukrainian people, but all the people of the region, I mean, even in nearby countries, I think Moldova, for example, but one could think of many countries that are being destabilized. There's economic hardship around the world, even in Southeast Asia and places very distant. But let me underline again, the human cost is huge. We have hundreds of people dying every day. I think we're over hundreds of thousands have been killed. That's not even to mention the wounded and many of the civilians. Think of all the orphans. To my estimate, we simply have to bring this to a close. Again, the people who say, well, we cannot give Putin a victory. Nobody thinks Putin has won this. He's gained, marginal bits of territory that, frankly, are of not much worth and only of his symbolic importance. And, he has egg all over his face, and everybody knows it. So we just need to bring an end to the carnage, because Russia has the resources to sustain this war, for to go on for a very long time, and Ukraine is suffering horribly. Moreover, Ukraine, as it exists in a future form, will be a strong and probably a very prosperous place. We should give it that chance and not have all its people slaughtered.
But Professor Freedman, you do not agree with that, I take it.
Well, no, I mean, look, nobody's going to disagree with the point that this has been a horrible war that has led to enormous devastation and far too many bereaved people. It's the result of one man's decision of a year ago, and it has horrible consequences. And yes, it would be great to see it come to a conclusion. Unfortunately, President Putin has not offered a whiff of compromise. Zelensky would be out of office if he offered territorial concessions at the moment. I spent a lot of time with Ukrainians yesterday. All of them said the same thing, that they will carry on. So they don't accept that they should concede. I think they would come under a lot of pressure to look at concessions if Putin had shown any interest in it. If he'd offered in his 2-hour speech the other day any suggestion of how a peace could be brought about, but he didn't. He hasn't said anything at all about a peace recently, other than Ukraine having to accept the loss of 4 provinces to Russia forever. And when you look at what we've seen of what's happened, which is just one point, when you look at what happened to Ukrainians under Russian occupation, you can understand why they don't want to leave any of their people under that sort of situation for the future.
All right, a final question to both of you. We could not have expected Mr. Putin to make any concessions in a speech of that nature, but still, informally, or perhaps behind the scenes, a Korean solution, armistice, but no peace deal. Is that a possibility? I'll start first with you, Professor Goldstein, and then Professor Freedman.
Yes, I think it is. Look, eventually the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, and yes, I also hope that there will be justice for Ukrainian victims and some restructuring of the relationship in a positive way. Look, most Ukrainians have Russian cousins, and Russians have Ukrainian cousins. That's the way it is with 2 people so proximate. So, but the complexities, travel, trade, and so forth, it's absolutely necessary. But you can't get everything into a peace agreement. So probably the best we can hope for with all this bitterness is going to be, a Korean type solution, which just means a halt along the current front lines and some minimal pullback of the forces to stabilize a line at the line of contact and prevent future bloodshed in a massive way, and hope that stabilizes over time. I mean, look, the Korean Peninsula is still tense today. Hopefully, this will follow a different path, but we need to be pragmatic, realistic, and apply restraint, because we live in an era of nuclear weapons, and we cannot let this escalate out of control.
And a final word from you, Professor Freedman.
Also, I can end on one point of agreement. I think it's very hard to see how there's going to be a full negotiated peace settlement. There's just too many issues that are too complex to be resolved, except over a prolonged period. You've got issues of reparations and war crimes, how you end sanctions. It's going to take a long time. And I also tend to agree that the most likely short-term conclusion would be a ceasefire armistice of some sort, possibly with disengagement. But I think before we get to that, you've got a Russian offensive that's ongoing at the moment that I don't think is looking very impressive, but we'll have to see how that develops. And then there's going to be Ukrainian offensive in the spring, and however much people might like the war to come to an end before that, I just don't think it will. People are going to see how that develops. If Ukraine doesn't make much progress in the spring, then the pressure for a ceasefire along those sorts of lines will grow. If it does make some progress, then it'll keep on going to see how far it can push Russia, and maybe then we will be looking at some of the dangers of escalation. But I think the military developments still have got a long way to go before you are going to get into a serious discussion of a long-term outcome.
All right, thank you so much for joining us, Professor Lyle Goldstein from Defence Priorities and Sir Lawrence Freedman from King's College London.